dark side, and this is one of two topics. Next Sunday I'm planning to preach on hell, and we're also going to have bread and cup communion. Now you'll want to come for that because you want to see how we're going to do that, so we can talk about what Jesus said about hell and also talk about bread and cup communion. But don't have it all. I don't have it all together yet, but it's going to be. We're going to have an interesting time, you might say. But this morning we're going to look at the dark side. And we're not going to get there right immediately, but we'll get there in a moment. There's Matthew chapter 13, 24 to 30. And this is where Jesus gives us what's called the parable of the wheat and the weeds, or you probably remember calling this the parable of the tares, the wheat and the tares. And this is what it says in Scripture. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed seeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, did you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them into bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." May the Lord add His blessing to the reading of His Word. So, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like, He says a man that sowed the weed, but I translated that to a farmer. And so Jesus tells us this parable about farming. And He says there was a problem. And the problem is one that, well, maybe today if we think about competition in the world and we think about corporate greed and then we think about corporate competition and then you can think about corporate sabotage, corporate, even espionage. In other words, and corporate espionage I think has to do with trying to figure out somebody else's secrets, trying to figure out what somebody's got going on inside their company, why they're having, and recently we just had one of these lawsuits. Remember the big lawsuit between Apple and who was it? No, Samsung.
Oh, that's
Apple and Samsung. Remember because one accused the other of using patent information. Now, the problem here was an enemy sowed weeds or tares in the man's, or because Jesus just calls him a man, He doesn't call him a farmer. He had sowed weeds into this wheat field. I didn't realize this, but one commentator points out that that's something that happened. It happened so often back then. Somebody sowing weeds in somebody else's wheat field. They actually had laws in Israel against it. I was amazed. The wonderful thing about Scripture, wonderful thing about studying Scripture, is that I always learn something. I am always almost bowled over by what I get when I look at Scripture. So anyway, this actually did happen back then. That people actually did, I guess it was just a form of one person wanting to get ahead of the other. So you sabotage somebody else's wheat field by putting weeds in there. Now, this is what wheat looks like. I am not a farmer. I'm not real experienced with this, but I got this picture and I really believe that's what wheat looks like. Now, weeds and tares, on the other hand, well, the literal translation for this is darnel or false grain. Now, if you look up darnel on the internet, you probably get a picture of either a guy or a gal, because there's two darnels that I found on the internet, but I also found real darnel, which is actually this grain that grows. It's called darnel or false grain, and for some that like the Latin stuff, it's Lolium tumulentum, typically known as darnel, Corson darnel, or cockle. Now, I did that for somebody in particular because somebody's always asking me the genus and species, and so I thought I'd throw that out there. Now, the other thing about this stuff is that we're told, at least on Google, and I believe it to be true, this darnel tends to have kind of a poisonous characteristic to it. As it gets older, as it matures, and the reason it's called, excuse me, the reason it's called by this name is that it actually means it's an intoxicant, and it makes a person drunk even to the point of dying. You know, and that's the thing. You know, when Jesus tells a parable, they're packed. They are packed full of information, because not only is this something you couldn't take to the marketplace. You know, if you're growing something, if you're growing wheat and you want to take this wheat to the marketplace, of course, remember it says he planted good seed. And part of planting good seed is you want to make sure that you don't have something mixed into your good seed. If you get a bag of grass seed, I think usually it'll say it's 99% pure. Yeah. But you know what? There's going to be some other stuff in there, and it's going to grow up, and you're going to have to get rid of it. Weeds, yeah. So when the man, the farmer, sowed this good seed, it was good seed. He made sure that it was only wheat. But his enemy came along and planted other. Now, as we read this parable, I think when we read parables, we just read them right through. We just rush right through. But I think you have to let it take a little time there and let it soak in a little bit, because they didn't notice it right away. The wheat, or the weeds, the darnel, had to germinate for a while, and had to grow up together, because you see, darnel looks a lot like wheat. It's similar. It's a grass. It looks a lot like wheat. And can you tell in this picture which is the darnel and which is the wheat? One on the right is the wheat. The one on the left is the darnel. Now, as it gets older, as I understand it, the darnel on the right this time, the darnel will turn, maybe some darnel, or some types of darnel will actually turn black. And so you can actually see, when it comes time for harvest, you can actually see the difference a lot more clearly. So, who is the enemy? Well, in this parable, and in a lot of Jesus' parable, of course, this is a parable that Jesus tells kind of about the end time, leading up to the end time, leading up to harvest, the end time. Now, who is the enemy? Well, I think the enemy is the devil here. I don't think Jesus says that the devil is the enemy, but I think we can assume that by this. Now, which is the field? Because I think in this particular parable, I've heard it go both ways. I've heard people argue, well, Jesus was talking about the church, and that there would be people in the church who weren't really Christians, who looked like Christians, act like Christians, sort of talk like Christians, but really weren't Christians, or at least they tried to put on that they were Christians. Or is the field the whole world, that God's going to wait, God's going to have both his Christians and non-Christians, believers and non-Christians are going to live together in the world to the end? So which is it? And I say, as we look at it, it doesn't really matter, does it? When you really come right down to it, it doesn't really matter. But the real thing will be known at harvest time. And when harvest comes, the end of time, we will know for sure what we are. Now, notice in harvest time, what does Jesus say? He says, in harvest, you're going to gather up the weeds. And something they did a lot of back there. If you read 1 John 15 about, I am the vine, you're the branches. If the branch doesn't bear fruit, what do? You gather it up and you burn it. A long time ago, I talked to Joe Becchio about this. And he says, well, the reason you did that is you got rid of the disease. By burning stuff, you got rid of the disease stuff. You got rid of disease and pesticides, especially stuff that wasn't working very well. So that's why you would burn that. And so, but Jesus always also uses this burning illustration as the fires of judgment, the end times. And of course, the other side that Jesus says, the good seed is going to be gathered where? In the barn. And so, just so you know, this is where we like to go. Okay? In this picture, this is heaven. Okay? This is that other place we're going to talk about next Sunday.